If it's a private developer, with the way that funding goes, the funders will often want rights of light issues gone before they will provide money.
That's really interesting, yeah.
So it often causes a delay in being able to create your development.
Yeah.
And this is the thing with rights of light, whereas daylight and sunlight, which is part of the planning process, is predominantly to do with residential accommodation.
Yeah.
Any property, any room will hold a right,
Right.
as long as it's been there for 20 years.
And even if it's a garage door that...
The knock-on that has on the developer is that their funders won't actually release any money, so they can't complete the development, and that we're in this absolute limbo at the moment.
This is the Property Development Book Club podcast. Please be advised that the views expressed are of the individuals and do not represent their employers and should not be taken as advice. Please do your own research and seek advice from an appointed professional.
Welcome to the Property Development Book Club podcast. I'm Hattie Walker-Arnott, and today I'm delighted to have with me Toby, Rogan, Lyons to talk about, do I have a right of light? Toby, you are a director in the natural light team at Lichfields, and we're delighted to have you here today. Now, I'd love to hear a little bit of your background. Can you let us know, how did you get into rights of light? Did you always want to be a rights of light surveyor?
No, absolutely not. I was originally a mechanical design engineer, but as part of that, I had computer CAD skills. Ended up working with a surveying company, creating their models that are used for daylight and sunlight studies.
Wow, okay.
And from that, grew into the role of undertaking daylight and sunlight studies, providing the reports, and then onto rights of light. So it sort of grew organically from a very technical background.
Which is what you need. It's a very technical topic, isn't it?
I would say so, yes. Yes, to understand all of the intricacies of all of the different testing, I think actually you should have a grounding in that technical element of it.
Absolutely. And can we start then? Can you give us the rights of light 101? What are the key things that someone needs to know? How long does it take to acquire a right? How do you know if you have one?
So basically a right of light exists. It's a right that a property has, and it's been granted by the Rights of Light Act. And in basic terms, a property will gain a right of light if it has had access to a certain level of light, particularly over a neighbouring plot of land, for 20 years or more. And therefore, under the Prescriptive Act, it's considered to have gained a right to that light. And anything that disturbs that could then introduce a rights of light injury.
And by disturb, what you mean is if a nasty developer comes along and builds a building next to you, they might not actually be able to build that building. Is that correct?
Exactly, yes. So if that building removes too much light, and what is then deemed to be a nuisance in the level of light reduction will cause a rights of light injury. And rights of light differ from what an awful lot of people know about daylight and sunlight, in that rights of light is a purely legal matter, has nothing to do with the planning system at all, and so differs from where most people's interaction with natural light might be as part of the planning process.
Yeah.
But rights of light is as I said, it's a right that's held by a property and therefore actually held by the owner of that property.
Right, and it's a legal right,
and
you can have a financial negotiation.
Yes, exactly. So when light is reduced and creates this injury, there is the default mechanism is effectively, if that landowner decided to take that dispute to court, in theory the default is that the court would then grant an injunction. If they consider that this reduction in light is indeed a nuisance, they will then grant an injunction against either the whole development or part of that development that causes that injury.
And an injunction, that means that you cannot build.
No, the injunction will form either, yes, a complete stop of being able to build, but will mostly be you can't build a certain element, that element that actually ends up causing the rights of light injury, and that element either cannot be built, so the scheme has to be modified, which would mean for a developer having to go through the whole planning process again. And there are indeed cases of where a development's actually being built, the injunction would ask the developer to remove those elements from the already existing building.
That's painful. So you've just put up your shiny brand new building and you literally have to take a chunk out of that building.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. It's a really interesting combination of some really technical mathematical calculations, and then you've got all the legalese side to it. And then at the end, you have a financial, well, hopefully financial, hopefully you can work it out financially, negotiation, which must sometimes be a bit of a horse trade.
It is, yes, it is. So yes, as I said, the default, in theory, if it goes to court, is an injunction, but most of the cases that we deal with don't actually come to court. We work out the level of light injury and then provide and attribute a financial value to that. And then it becomes a negotiation process as to how much compensation a developer is willing to pay and how much the injured party is willing to accept.
Yeah.
And it becomes this whole negotiation process, usually between someone like myself and a surveyor acting for the neighbour. And we undertake the technical aspect of it. The opposing surveyor will agree with that. We'll get to a stage where they've agreed with that technical aspect of it. And then we get into the bun fight about how much that's actually worth. Yeah.
Get down to the real stuff. And so people might not realise, I think probably a lot of people who maybe aren't developers, aren't in the industry, might not realise that if someone goes and builds a building next door to them, they may well be able to get a bit of cash.
Yes, if they think that they're going to have a reduction in light, then yes, and particularly if they're a property owner, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the freeholder. Leaseholders can indeed gain their own rights. Yes, they have the legal ability to defend that right. Now, as I said, most cases will end up in a discussion about compensation.
Yeah. And so can you give me an example of a project that you've worked on that you feel went really well? You were like, that is a good result.
Yes, absolutely. There's quite a recent one I've worked on, which is where we were working with the local authority on one of their own developments. And we'd been undertaking daylight and sunlight studies as part of the planning process, and as part of that, we'd done rights of light analysis. And so we highlighted to the local authority where all of the rights of light injuries could occur.
So this is all the housing around their ownership that would lose light.
And so we highlighted that risk to them. They were able to actually bring all of that risk into the viability of the scheme. And being a local authority, a power that the local authority have, if the scheme falls into certain categories, they can appropriate the land for development. And what that appropriation does is remove the ability of neighbouring property owners to seek an injunction.
Okay, so let's put it in layman's terms. So when it's a local authority, they can say, we won't have an injunction on our development, which means that we won't change the shape if it causes a rights of light injury, but we will still give people money.
Yes, because it falls under the CPO categorisation.
Okay.
So they're effectively, it's not quite, but they're effectively CPOing your rights.
Your rights to light.
But it does mean they have to provide compensation.
Okay.
And so on this scheme, we highlighted all of this to the local authority, and they appropriated the land because it's desperately needed social housing.
Yeah.
And they were able to carry on with their build timeline while we dealt with rights. And so we contacted all of the neighbours where we thought there was an injury and started the whole negotiation process and managed to actually negotiate settlements with all of the neighbouring owners.
Wow.
While the building was going on, because if it's a private developer, with the way that funding goes, the funders will often want rights of light issues gone before they will provide money.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
So it often causes a delay in being able to create your development. Yeah.
Yeah. It also strikes me as pretty good stakeholder engagement to be able to go to the neighbours of a development and say, hey, sorry, we're going to put up a big building. It is going to impact you, but we would like
Yeah.
to give you some cash.
Yeah, exactly that. And in fact, in this particular case, that's exactly what they did. There were other issues. I mean, there were things, there were going to be some fairly large cranes on the site. There were going to be issues that were building right up to the boundaries of some of these properties.
Right.
So they needed to engage with these neighbours anyway. So
Yeah.
it became part of that negotiation and part of that engagement.
Yeah, and that relationship
and
building.
was, in most cases, very smooth.
Good, yeah.
So, yeah.
That's really interesting. That's a really nice, positive way to see that negotiation. So on the flip side, dare I ask,
Yes.
can you give us an example where it's gone all wrong?
Yeah, again, quite a recent one. A developer who has bought a piece of land, it already has planning. Their intention is to build out the planning consent, and there is one neighbouring owner that actually is affected. It's the only neighbouring owner that directly overlooks the site, and they have already stepped forward saying that they're going to defend their rights.
Right.
We were brought on board, we've done the analysis, and there is a rights of light injury, but it's a rights of light injury to their garage.
To a garage.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is the thing with rights of light, whereas daylight and sunlight, which is part of the planning process, is predominantly to do with residential accommodation.
Yeah.
Not totally, hospitals and schools and things have to be tested as well.
Yeah.
But it's predominantly residential. But rights, any property, any room will hold a right,
Right.
as long as it's been there for 20 years.
And even if it's a garage door that.
Well, that's one of the grey areas of
Right,
a garage door. This is a
interesting.
side window into a garage, and there is this injury. And unfortunately, this neighbouring owner is retired, is independently wealthy, and just isn't interested in the money. He just simply doesn't want a development next to them.
Wow.
And is refusing to negotiate.
Right.
And the knock-on that has on the developer is that their funders won't actually release any money, so they can't complete the development, and that we're in this absolute limbo at the moment.
And I think, from a developer's perspective, you think once something's got planning, you feel that
You're risk-free,
your risk is pretty minimal. You're worried about construction risk, market, but that's a huge chunk gone. But what you're saying here is actually us developers need to watch out, because it's not just about getting planning. You can still literally not be able to deliver something, even if your planning is all good. You could have all your conditions discharged, everything, but if you haven't got your rights of light, you're not building a building.
Yeah, it can absolutely stop a development.
Yeah.
And it's becoming more prevalent that this is an issue post-COVID, quite frankly.
Right. Why do you think that is?
People have spent 2 years locked in their house looking out of their window. They're much more aware of what's going on outside their own windows. And they're also just much more engaged with what's going on outside their own windows.
Okay, and this is all good.
And I mean, my own personal theory is people have become more used to the natural light that's in their home. Before COVID, we didn't actually spend a lot of time in our own homes.
Yeah.
Whereas 2 years locked in a house, I think subconsciously you become aware of where the best light is.
Yeah, definitely.
And if anything's going to interrupt that, actually people are much more aware now of where the good sunlight is, where's the nice bit of the house to actually have the breakfast in the morning, and where's the bit to enjoy the afternoon sunlight. They're much more aware of that.
That's so interesting.
And quite frankly, a quick internet search on light will bring up rights of light as an issue.
Yeah.
There have been some very high profile cases that have just brought it up on that whole search engine, and it's now
a little bit more in the public
so
domain.
People are much more eager to come forward and defend their rights, whereas previously they perhaps weren't.
And on that, if someone is listening to this and their neighbour 2 years ago put up an extension that they feel had an injury or reduced the light in their home, can you do you have any rights retroactively, or do you have to do it all before the development is completed?
That's a very difficult question to answer because it kind of depends on. I mean, in theory, if you gained your rights through prescription,
And prescription is
20 years of uninterrupted access, and then something has interrupted that period for over a year and you did nothing about that,
Yeah.
that prescriptive clock has effectively wound back to zero.
So
you'd
you've got
have
to
to
start
wait another
20
20 years,
Ugh.
and if they then build, you then got right. However, if you're the freeholder and your property, you can show that your property is over a certain age and that at some point within that point you've had 20 years of uninterrupted access and that nothing has changed, in theory, yes, you can then actually say, actually, I have this right that you've interrupted, and I'm sorry, but I forgot to deal with it then. And let's
Take
deal
it
with
down.
it now. Yeah,
Take down your nice
that's
kitchen
quite
extension.
Rare.
Okay.
Yeah, that is quite rare, just simply because properties, particularly residential properties, you don't tend to have a massive elongated period of ownership.
Yeah. Good point.
But it can come up.
So you mentioned about people just being a lot more acutely aware. I think one of the other things that is hopefully changing as well will be the sheer volume of delivery of homes. Obviously, we know that this is a really important matter. So my assumption is if we're building more homes, there's going to be more densification, more urbanisation. Do you think it's an area that's going to be growing over the coming
I think there'll
years?
be more rights of light issues that come up. People are more aware. As I said, a quick internet search brings up rights of light and brings up some very notable cases where there were some massive compensation payments, and I think that excites people.
What are we talking when we say massive?
There's very notable cases where it was in the millions.
Nice.
So, and that was quite a public case for those in the industry.
Yeah.
That was quite a rare one. That was in the City of London, and there were other elements to it. But those kind of figures that bandy about excite people. So I think people are more likely to come forward.
Interesting.
The information is there. There are now companies out there that are making people aware of their rights.
Are they like ambulance tasters for rights of light? Love it.
Absolutely. And they're quite aggressive, some of these companies, in making people aware. So we are seeing a lot more claims coming forward.
So arguably, it's a really good sector, good part of the industry to be getting into.
Yes, in theory, yes, absolutely. It is a growing sector. As I said, there are now companies that simply do rights of light. On the flip side, as Lichfields, we tend to work advising developers about the issues. And so what we've always said is that as part of your whole planning process, you should be doing daylight and sunlight anyway.
Yeah.
Tack rights of light on, be aware of the risks, because there are ways to manage that risk. And hopefully the best way is to actually change the design of the development so you don't have a rights of light injury and it doesn't jump out and surprise you.
Yeah.
That very much depends on the type of developer that we're working with and what their attitude to risk is. But it is one of these things. It is becoming more prevalent and it is jumping out and stopping development.
Actually, stopping delivery. That's really interesting. So what would you say to someone who either is looking for a career in rights of light or may not even know that they wanted a career? What makes a good rights of light surveyor?
Now that's where industries will differ, but I would say having a good technical background. So if you've got a background and an interest in surveying, and the practical side of surveying in particular, actually looking at buildings and how buildings interact with each other, and actually looking and measuring up buildings and that sort of thing. And then have, as I said, I came from a technical background, and I think that's a very good grounding because it means you can walk into places and have almost that matrix moment of looking at the light and realising if there's going to be an injury before you've done analysis. But then you have to have good negotiation skills.
Good people skills.
And an awful lot of what we do is this arbitration. You have these parties who might well have started off with a good relationship, but then rights of light rear their head, and now there's this animosity between them. And particularly if a development is ongoing and there have been issues in terms of noise and dust.
Yeah.
And then rights of light gets tacked on, and they've lost that goodwill. And you end up with these points of, or you have that neighbour who just simply sees it as a bit of a game.
Yeah, yeah.
And is just obstinate. And so you have to have the ability to, A, not take things personally, because it can get quite personal,
Yeah.
and just be able to try and settle people down and get them talking. So you have to have that good arbitration skill.
So basically like a therapist.
In some ways, yeah.
And can you talk to me a little bit about the technology that you do use and where you see areas for growth in this?
So rights of light are based on a system of measurement that was developed by Waldron in the early 1900s, and it's all based around the amount of light that is in theory available from from 2% of the sky dome. And what we do when we undertake analysis is we will create this computer model of the existing scenario, the proposed scenario, all of the neighbouring buildings and all of the rooms in the neighbouring buildings.
Wow.
Analyse how much light they were getting before, and and what the area of each room that can see this 2% of sky is, and then how much that will be once the development is in place, and if that light is reduced so that the traditional calculation is that if a room is left with less than 50% of its area being able to see 2% of the sky, a rights of light injury occurs.
Okay.
But the courts have shown that for residential, actually, they don't think 50% is quite enough.
Yeah.
So there's this sort of grey area from 50 to 60%. And if you're in that area, there's a potential nuisance, which is the basis of rights of light. Yeah. Or it might not be enough of a nuisance and might not actually be a rights of light injury. And it's that, there's that grey area.
And again, that comes down to your point about negotiation, that it's not a hard and fast line.
So, but the technical side of it is, we work this area out and we can work out what the total area loss is. And this is how antiquated the sort of system is that we're still working in feet.
Wow.
So you work out how much light loss in feet there is, and then attribute a value to that, which is based on a rental yield and a value of traditionally about £5 per square foot is the value of light.
Wow, okay.
Traditionally. There are times when those values have to change, and it depends on the building type and its use and such, but that's basically what it's down to. So in terms of technology, it's just this computer-aided testing.
Yeah.
And that's it.
So 3D models, like the architects.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. A lot of people, and in fact dealt with one last week, think that you'll be walking in there with lux meters and registering light. It's just a theoretical amount of light.
So how would you, as someone who loves technology, how would you like that to change in the future?
I think there is very much a case for changing the way that rights of light is analysed, to bring it more into the way that daylight is analysed as part of the planning process. And particularly now that the guidance on daylight has changed. It changed in 2022.
Recently, okay.
Very recent change in the way that daylight within properties is tested. Now, all of those changes are to do with, and the changes in the way it's tested are to do with proposed developments.
Yeah.
But they're very, very good. Under daylight for a proposed development, we can test the average lux levels across a room, and we can show the changes in the lux levels, and you can show, which areas of room will actually get how much light, and we can then hone that down. We can work out specific days, times.
So October versus August.
Yeah, we can run analysis. If there's a tree outside, we can make allowances for how much daylight will come through that tree in full leaf and how much will come through in winter.
So this is the really granular understanding of the light.
Yes.
But this is just daylight.
That is daylight.
Not for rights of light.
And I think actually there is very much a case for showing, because rights of light is based on, is a nuisance caused?
Okay.
And so I think there is a case.
So is it a problem?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if we can map out that light, I think there is a case for showing, actually, is there a nuisance caused? It was getting this amount of light, it's now getting this amount of light, but actually that's still very good light.
Yeah.
However, that has been tried in the courts, and the courts have thrown that method out.
Interesting.
They simply revert back to the Waldron method.
To the traditional. Keeping it easy peasy.
Yeah. So I think there is, I mean, the Law Commission over a decade ago now, I think, actually said that rights of light should be brought into the planning process, but that's never been acted on.
Yeah.
And, I don't
And
think
so
it'll
just
change.
quickly, because you've mentioned it a few times, daylight sunlight is about how much light we're actually getting,
yeah.
and that is a planning issue, and that's
Absolute planning
becoming actually kind of going up the agenda as people are much more aware about.
Again,
the
it comes
impact on
down, yeah, particularly post-COVID. I mean, it's always been part of the planning process. It's mentioned in the NPPF.
Yeah.
Natural light has to remain appropriate.
Yeah.
So it's part of that process. And there is a guide, you know, the BRE report, which is the British Research Establishment Guide on Daylight and Sunlight, which is based on the British Standard.
Right.
And it provides these guidance targets for daylight and sunlight. And as part of the planning process, planning officers are supposed to consider it.
Yeah.
They're supposed to ask for a developer to test how a building will affect its neighbours, and also if that development is for residential, what future residents are going to experience in terms of daylight and sunlight.
Okay.
The issue comes in that the targets that are given in the BRE report are aspirational, and they are
Right.
based on a lower level of development than we get in urban areas.
Right. Okay. So just
So-
a few stories.
Yes, exactly
Yeah.
that. So if you've got, and particularly if you've got a building that is going to be a significant number of stories, that is surrounded by buildings that are of a significant number of stories, you're never going to
whole
have full
dynamic
compliance,
changes,
particularly at lower
yeah.
level. And that's where the tricky element comes in when we're dealing with daylight and sunlight, and particularly when we're talking to planning officers or planning committees, is showing them that yes, you haven't got compliance with these targets,
Yeah.
but hopefully we can show it's still appropriate under
It's
the
still a
NPPF
good level of
guidance. Yeah.
But so that, I mean, because that's a favourite APC question, is what's the difference? So daylight, sunlight, that is a planning issue. That is something you might not get planning if you don't have appropriate daylight, sunlight.
Yeah.
Rights of light,
A legal
planners don't
matter.
care?
No, they don't care.
Don't care.
It should never
It's-
be part of the planning process.
Okay.
It's a private legal matter.
So if someone objects on the matter of rights to light,
A planning officer should, in
they
theory,
should
discount
discount
that. Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Great, that's good distinction, thank you. And now one of my experiences working with rights of light surveyors is I feel like there's a lot of passion. I feel like people absolutely love rights of light. Toby, do you love rights of light, and why, if you do?
There are elements of it that I do love, and I think it's mostly to do with the arbitration side of things, or particularly if you've worked with a development and been working very closely with the design team from the get-go. So we've been doing daylight and sunlight and rights of light testing, and that development has changed and morphed as we've gone through the analysis, and we've reduced those risks down, and there are those risks. And then particularly if we're working with a proactive developer who doesn't shy away from the issue, and particularly, say, a local authority, and we can then go and approach people and say, actually, here is an issue, and this is what we want to do about it.
So
And
you
those
like
processes go well.
finding the solutions, making the buildings work for daylight, sunlight, and rights of light.
Very much so, and
Yeah.
and that's the passionate side of it.
Yeah.
Is particularly. I know I've been doing this for 20 years, and I'm wandering around, particularly in London, but all over the country, walking around and seeing a development that's been up that you had a hand in.
That's cool.
And there are some as well that people might look at and think, it's a slightly odd shape.
Yeah,
But there's a reason for that shape. And it
and
was just,
you know, and
and
no
I
one else
know,
knows.
yes. Yes, exactly. And yeah, seeing that. And so there are quite a few, you'll see quite a few rounded buildings, for instance.
Right.
And that is quite often shaped by daylight and sunlight and rights of light issues.
Fascinating.
And yeah. And
There you go. So you might not realise the fundamental impact that rights of light has on our day-to-day environment, but there's a little bit of insight into it. Toby, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Property Development Book Club podcast. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
In the privacy book club, we're raising up the rules. privacy book club.